Greetings and welcome. We are in Junior English, and we now turn to the great Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain. I'm with you in your hymnals on 566, 567, 68, and 69. 569 will give you the before you read information for literary analysis. We will be looking at two Twain offerings. We'll be looking at a passage from his famous autobiography about life on the Mississippi, and we will also be looking at his most famous comic story about a frog, a jumping frog. All right? I want to begin with biography information first, just to make sure that we kind of know who this guy is on page 566, 567. Now, if you've already looked at the biography information, I hope that you have, let's talk through some of the high points. First of all, let's go ahead and say that Twain, for your notes at level 1, Twain is one of the first true American writers. We will put him along with Walt Whitman as one of the first true American authors. Now, what do I mean by that? Because Longfellow was obviously an American. Emerson was obviously an American. Probably, though, if you had to say it, the three writers that we would qualify as just genuinely American would be Whitman and Thoreau, and now Mark Twain. What is it that makes them so fundamentally American? First of all, it has a lot to do with their understanding of dialect. Dialect. In other words, they are the first writers to really capture the linguistic nuances of American English. Okay? Twain especially has an ear for the different ways people speak English depending on where they are. And when Twain writes his stuff, as we will see, especially in the second of our offerings here, he will try to capture some of that dialect, the way people talk, especially the way they pronounce words differently depending on where they are in the country, where they come from in the country. Let's turn now to Twain himself and comment that Twain is one of America's greatest novelists. So we want to write this down about him as well. Now, in your junior year, normally you are introduced already sometime in high school to two of his most famous novels, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Adventures of Huck Finn. You can list both of these at 3A as well as texts that are relational. Twain loves regionalism as a basis for his stuff. Regionalism. In other words, where he sets his stories matters. The region where they are set. Twain is very interested in the South of America and the West. But of all symbols that matter to Twain, the most important is the Mississippi River. So let's talk a little bit about the importance of rivers in America. In many ways you could argue, America is a country that is built around rivers. Now, this doesn't make America any different from the great rivers of Europe, the great rivers of Africa. We think of the Nile, don't we? The great rivers of India, we think of the Ganges. The great rivers of China, we think of the Yangtze and others, of course, the Great Yellow River. We define civilization often around water sources. For America, the great river, the Hudson River, of course, for New England, New York. But for the rest of America, the great river is, for Twain, the great symbol of America, the Mississippi River. So we want to write that down. For Twain, everything about America is defined by the Mississippi River. It is in many ways a boundary. That is to say, you can talk in Twain's day about events that happen east of the Mississippi, west of the Mississippi. Believe it or not, for a very long time in America, you were considered west if you were to the western side of the Mississippi River. Okay? Now today, we don't call that region the West, we call it the Midwest or the Middle West. The areas that we know of today as Kansas, as Nebraska, these kinds of areas are qualified as the Midwest. And then where you live, out here in Wyoming, is considered the West. Everything kind of from you all the way to California is considered West. In Twain's day, Kansas City was West because it was west of the Mississippi. The second thing that made the Mississippi so important for Twain is that it ran north and south. It ran up and down, showing us how you navigated through America. The primary form of transportation for economics was on this river. One of the major ports in all of America was at the south of this river, right at the very end, New Orleans. So you could take product and move it up and down this river. And in that regards, the Mississippi River became like the primary artery, in the same way that you have in your body blood right now pumping through your arteries, and you have a central artery that will provide the majority of the blood. Twain saw the Mississippi River in this way. It was the symbol, number 3, it was the symbol of freedom for slaves. The river allowed many, many slaves to try to escape and get north by this river. And in fact, in both Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn, but especially in Huck Finn, the Mississippi River becomes that symbol of freedom, of emancipation, of a way to get free. Of course, the Mississippi River for Twain also represented life. He was not the first to talk about life kind of like a river. The river itself is a very dangerous river. Even today, the Mississippi River, very dangerous, especially when it begins to swell with lots of runoff and flooding. It can become a very, very dangerous body of water. Lots of people have found their end on the Mississippi River. For Twain, he was very interested in the boats that were a part of navigating up and down the Mississippi River. If, for example, you take a look at on page 566, you'll see a picture of Twain as a riverboat pilot. And then over on page 570, you can actually see one of these riverboats. Now, Twain was very interested in these riverboats, and from the time he was young, he dreamed of having the possibility of traveling on these boats and then ultimately being a pilot on these boats. And so he will write a famous series of comments called Life on the Mississippi. Now, we'll talk about Twain as humorist. We'll talk about Twain as cynic when we pick up our second of our 2 titles. Here, I just want to point out that we're going to be talking about Twain as learning as a young boy. Let's go ahead and take a look now on page 570, the building background information there. Twain was an eyewitness. Are you reading it with me on 570? I hope you are. 570, background information. Mark Twain, was an eyewitness to the 19th century's expansion of the western frontier. He was a young man when wagon trains left his home state of Missouri to cross the prairies, and he later saw the Transcontinental Railroad built. He traveled through the nation, working first on the Mississippi and then in the West before settling in Connecticut. However, as this excerpt shows, the Mississippi River held a special place in his memory. Let's go ahead now and just listen to the reading. Follow along, page 570, one of America's greatest writers, Mark Twain, Life on the Mississippi.
From Life on the Mississippi by Mark Twain. When I was a boy, there was but one permanent ambition among my comrades in our village on the west bank of the Mississippi River. That was to be a steamboatman. We had transient ambitions of other sorts, but they were only transient. When a circus came and went, it left us all burning to become clowns. The first Negro minstrel show that came to our section left us all suffering to try that kind of life. Now and then we had a hope that if we lived and were good, God would permit us to be pirates. These ambitions faded out, each in its turn. But the ambition to be a steamboatman always remained. Once a day, a cheap, gaudy packet arrived upward from St. Louis, and another downward from Keokuk. Before these events, the day was glorious with expectancy. After them, the day was a dead and empty thing. Not only the boys, but the whole village felt this. After all these years, I can picture that old time to myself now, just as it was then. the white town drowsing in the sunshine of a summer's morning. The streets empty, or pretty nearly so. One or two clerks sitting in front of the Water Street stores, with their split-bottom chairs tilted back against the wall. Chins on breasts, hats slouched over their faces, asleep, with shingle shavings enough around to show what broke them down. A sow and a litter of pigs loafing along the sidewalk, doing a good business in watermelon rinds and seeds. 2 or 3 lonely little freight piles scattered about the levee. A pile of skids on the slope of the stone-paved wharf, and the fragrant town drunkard asleep in the shadow of them. 2 or 3 wood flats at the head of the wharf, but nobody to listen to the peaceful lapping of the wavelets against them. The great Mississippi, the majestic, the magnificent Mississippi, rolling its mile-wide tide along, shining in the sun, the dense forest away on the other side. The point above the town and the point below, bounding the river glimpse and turning it into a sort of sea, and withal a very still and brilliant and lonely one. Presently, a film of dark smoke appears above one of those remote points.
Page 572.
Instantly, a Negro drayman, famous for his quick eye and prodigious voice, lifts up the cry, "Steamboat a-comin'!" And the scene changes. The town drunkard stirs. The clerks wake up. A furious clatter of drays follows. Every house and store pours out a human contribution. And all in a twinkling, the dead town is alive and moving. Drays, carts, men, boys, all go hurrying from many quarters to a common center, the wharf. Assembled there, the people fasten their eyes upon the coming boat as upon a wonder they are seeing for the first time. And the boat is, rather, a handsome sight, too. She is long and sharp and trim and pretty. She has 2 tall, fancy-topped chimneys, with a gilded device of some kind swung between them. A fanciful pilot house, all glass and gingerbread, perched on top of the Texas deck behind them. The paddle boxes are gorgeous, with a picture or with gilded rays above the boat's name. The boiler deck, the hurricane deck, and the Texas deck are fenced and ornamented with clean white railings. There is a flag gallantly flying from the jackstaff. The furnace doors are open, and the fires glaring bravely. The upper decks are black with passengers. The captain stands by the big bell, calm, imposing, the envy of all. Great volumes of the blackest smoke are rolling and tumbling out of the chimneys. A husbanded grandeur created with a bit of pitch pine just before arriving at a town. The crew are grouped on the forecastle. The broad stage is run far out over the port bow, and an envied deckhand stands picturesquely on the end of it with a coil of rope in his hand. The pent steam is screaming through the gauge cocks. The captain lifts his hand. A bell rings. The wheels stop. Then they turn back, churning the water to foam, and the steamer is at rest. Then such a scramble as there is to get aboard and to get ashore and to take in freight and to discharge freight.
Top of 573.
All at one and the same time. And such a yelling and cursing as the mates facilitate it all with. 10 minutes later, the steamer is underway again, with no flag on the jackstaff and no black smoke issuing from the chimneys. After 10 more minutes, the town is dead again, and the town drunkard asleep by the skids once more. My father was a justice of the peace, and I supposed he possessed the power of life and death over all men and could hang anybody that offended him. This was distinction enough for me as a general thing, but the desire to be a steamboatman kept intruding nevertheless. I first wanted to be a cabin boy, so that I could come out with a white apron on and shake a tablecloth over the side, where all my old comrades could see me. Later, I thought I would rather be the deckhand who stood on the end of the stage plank with a coil of rope in his hand, because he was particularly conspicuous. But these were only daydreams. They were too heavenly to be contemplated as real possibilities. By and by, one of our boys went away. He was not heard of for a long time. At last he turned up as apprentice engineer or striker on a steamboat. This thing shook the bottom out of all my Sunday school teachings. That boy had been notoriously worldly, and I just the reverse. Yet he was exalted to this eminence, and I left in obscurity and misery. There was nothing generous about this fellow and his greatness. He would always manage to have a rusty boat to scrub, while his boat tarried at our town, and he would sit on the inside guard and scrub it, where we could all see him and envy him and loathe him. And whenever his boat was laid up, he would come home and swell around the town in his blackest and greasiest clothes, so that nobody could help remembering that he was a steamboatman. And he used all sorts of steamboat technicalities in his talk, as if he were so used to them that he forgot common people could not understand them. He would speak of the larboard side of a horse in an easy, natural way that would make one wish he was dead. And he was always talking about St. Louis like an old citizen. He would refer casually to occasions when he was coming down 4th Street, or when he was passing by the planter's house, or when there was a fire and he took a turn on the brakes of the old Big Missouri. And then he would go on and lie about how many towns the size of ours were burned down there that day. 2 or 3 of the boys had long been persons of consideration among us, because they had been to St. Louis once and had a vague general knowledge of its wonders. But the day of their glory was over now. They lapsed into a humble silence and learned to disappear when the ruthless cub engineer approached. This fellow had money, too, and heroin. Also an ignorant silver watch and a showy brass watch chain. He wore a leather belt and used no suspenders. If ever a youth was
Top of 574.
admired and hated by his comrades, this one was. No girl could withstand his charms. He cut out every boy in the village. When his boat blew up at last, it diffused a tranquil contentment among us, such as we had not known for months. But when he came home the next week, alive, renowned, and appeared in church all battered up and bandaged, a shining hero, stared at and wondered over by everybody, it seemed to us that the partiality of Providence for an undeserving reptile had reached a point where it was open to criticism. This creature's career could produce but one result, and it speedily followed. Boy after boy managed to get on the river. The minister's son became an engineer. The doctor's and the postmaster's sons became mud clerks. The wholesale liquor dealer's son became a barkeeper on a boat. 4 sons of the chief merchant and 2 sons of the county judge became pilots. Pilot was the grandest position of all. The pilot, even in those days of trivial wages, had a princely salary, from $150 to $250 a month, and no board to pay. 2 months of his wages would pay a preacher's salary for a year. Now, some of us were left disconsolate. We could not get on the river. At least our parents would not let us. So by and by I ran away. I said I never would come home again till I was a pilot and could come in glory. But somehow I could not manage it. I went meekly aboard a few of the boats that lay packed together like sardines at the long St. Louis wharf, and very humbly inquired for the pilots, but got only a cold shoulder and short words from mates and clerks. I had to make the best of this sort of treatment for the time being, but I had comforting daydreams of a future when I should be a great and honored pilot with plenty of money and could kill some of these mates and clerks and pay for them.
Okay, let's go ahead now and just do a quick annotation of this reading. We'll start at level 1. Let's just summarize really quickly the two parts of this reading. Part 1, let's work at level 1 now. Part 1 talks about the importance of the river in the small Missouri town where Twain lived. Notice that before the boat arrives, the town is kind of like asleep, right? Slow, not a very big deal. And then all of a sudden when the boat arrives, everything changes, right? Everybody's all excited. And then when the boat leaves, back we go. In other words, it's a small town, kind of like the one that maybe you've lived in, where not a lot happens. It's kind of like repetitive and boring. And the only exciting thing that ever happens is when this riverboat shows up. The second part of the reading has to do with the influence of the riverboat to his understanding as a boy of what it is to grow up and have a job. There's a young boy who is going to gain a position on the boat, and immediately his position in the town, especially among the young boys, improves dramatically. He can, for example, have the attention of any girl he wants because he has a job on the boat. It makes him a different, a bigger kind of person. And finally, at the end of our reading, young Twain decides he himself wants to become, of all things, the coolest would be to be a pilot on the ship. Now, let's go to 2A really quickly. Themes, messages from a simple reading like this. One obvious message is that Twain will point out that in many ways we become what we see.